Now, moving on to the second point I wanted to focus on, and the one that's most relevant to our class, is where Darwin gives an evolutionary explanation for morality, or what he calls our moral disposition. He actually addresses two aspects of human nature. One is that we have what he calls the intellectual powers, the powers of reason, and two, that we have morality. We are moral creatures. So we are both rational creatures and moral creatures, which is the traditional way that human beings have defined themselves in distinction from the rest of nature. We are rational. We have the capacity to reason, and we are moral. We know the difference between good and evil. This is the definitive way that, for instance, Thomas Aquinas regards us, and is his interpretation of what it means to be made in God's image. If you think again back to Genesis, it says that human beings were made in the image of God, and Thomas interprets that as not being literal, but rather that we are like God insofar as we have reason and will. We are both rational creatures and free creatures in the sense that we can take responsibility for our actions because we can see the difference between good and evil. So nothing could be more central to the self-definition of human beings, the way that they've seen themselves traditionally, than these two issues of rationality and morality. And what Darwin is doing here is, in a way, I mean, he wouldn't see it as being in any way reducing the dignity of human beings, but he's giving a naturalistic evolutionary explanation of these two features that were more traditionally seen as the God-given features of human beings. And he's saying, no, they emerged just like any other feature, like our senses or our opposable thumbs or our ability to walk upright. They were things that developed in human beings in an evolutionary way. So then he has to provide some sort of explanation of how that could possibly have happened. And the first thing that he addresses is our intellectual powers, our powers of our intelligence, because obviously we're the most intelligent species. There's just no question about it. And, how could that have happened? How could we, unless it was a God-given trait, how could it happen? And he dismisses that as being an exaggeration. For instance, he says, consider the interval between the mental powers of one of the higher apes and of a fish. So think of the intelligence of a chimpanzee and a goldfish. And that presents no less of a problem than trying to comparing human intelligence with, say, the intelligence of a typical mammal. That is, the gulf is just as great, really, if not, maybe not just as great, but almost as great. So it's not that unusual that there are these huge gulfs of intelligence between living things. So that in itself is not anything that should be difficult to fit into the theory of evolution. And he says more controversially, he says, with our domesticated animals, the mental faculties are certainly variable. That is, one individual cow or sheep or pig is more intelligent than another. And the variations are inherited. That is, his claim is that, let's say that one pig is smarter than the rest of the pigs. To say that the variation is inherited is to say that that pig will pass, if it has offspring, it'll pass on that higher intelligence to its offspring. So he says, no one doubts that the mental powers, are of the utmost importance to animals in a state of nature. Therefore, the conditions are favorable for their development through natural selection. The same conclusion may be extended to man. The intellect must have been all important to him, even in a very remote period, as enabling him to invent and use language, to make weapons, tools, traps, etc., whereby, with the aid of his social habits, he long ago became the most dominant of all living creatures. Intelligence is an advantage. And it was an advantage that was passed on through the mechanism of natural selection, as I outlined it in the last video. So we just got smarter and smarter as a species in the way that maybe some animals got faster and faster, or stronger and stronger, or other features that help them to adapt. Intelligence is an adaptation. And our ancestors, they must have gone through a period where it was intelligence, the capacity to reason, which was their major advantage over other animals and between each other, and that the smartest survived, and here we are. That's at least his explanation. As he says here, when we talk about morality, it's a more interesting problem and a more difficult problem. But look at what he actually says here. How can we account for our own moral nature, our capacity for morality? Well, he says, think of two important things in our background that evolved. One, he says, we're social creatures. We have social instincts, like a lot of other creatures, as he says, right? He says, animals endowed with the social instincts, right here, take pleasure in one another's company, warn one another of danger, defend and aid one another in many ways. So presumably those creatures, those non-human creatures who are obviously social, have some sort of instinctual urge to live with each other and help each other sometimes. They have other urges, selfish urges too, which is important. So just to say we have those instincts, we have those social instincts, and we have for a long time, maybe even before we were human. Well, he says, combine that with our high intelligence. Right? That is, imagine a creature that has social instincts combined with having very high intelligence, and that very high intelligence would entail the capacity to think over our actions. So he says here, a moral being is one who is capable of reflecting on his past actions and their motives, of approving of some and disapproving of others. That's what we can do. And the fact that man is the one being who certainly deserves this designation is the greatest of all distinctions between him and the lower animals. But in the fourth chapter, I have endeavored to show that the moral sense follows, firstly, from the enduring and ever-present nature of the social instincts. Secondly, from man's appreciation of the approbation and disapprobation of his fellows. And thirdly, from the high activity of his mental faculties, with past impressions extremely vivid. And in these latter respects, he differs from the lower animals. Owing to this condition of mind, man cannot, and I'm right here, avoid looking both backwards and forwards and comparing past impressions. And here's the key point. Hence, after some temporary desire or passion has mastered his social instincts, I mean, we have selfish instincts too. So say you do something selfish, you hurt another human being. You imagine our primitive ancestors, I mean like pre-human ancestors. Say they hurt another member of the species in an act of rage or selfishness. Well, and then they remember doing this, right? That takes intelligence. Hence, after some temporary desire or passion has mastered his social instincts, he reflects and compares the now weakened impression of such past impulses with the ever-present social instincts, and he then feels that sense of dissatisfaction which all unsatisfied instincts leave behind them. That is, the social instinct now in memory is still there after the selfish instinct has faded, and feels that in memory, relives that moment of selfishness, and has that sense of dissatisfaction which any unsatisfied instinct will produce. And and then feels that sense of dissatisfaction which all unsatisfied instincts leave behind them. He therefore resolves to act differently for the future, and this is conscience. That's an incredible statement, because basically he's given a scientific, evolutionary, natural explanation of conscience. Conscience has its origins in human beings in unfulfilled social instincts. Pretty amazing. So he's given what he believes to be a full account of the origin of the moral sense in human beings right there. Now, he definitely thinks that we've come a long way since then, right? So, he doesn't think that we're still operating on that level, but it's that got us started as moral creatures. As he says, the moral nature of man has reached its present standard partly through the advancement of his reasoning powers and consequently of a just public opinion, but especially from his sympathies having been rendered more tender and widely diffused through the effects of habit, example, instruction, and reflection. Of course, part of our moral nature is our education. It is not improbable that after long practice, virtuous tendencies may be inherited. That's ridiculous, but sometimes Darwin made mistakes. With the more civilized races, the conviction of the existence of an all seeing deity has had a potent influence on the advance of morality. Ultimately, man does not accept the praise or blame of his fellows as a sole guide, though few escape this influence, but his habitual convictions, controlled by reason, afford him the safest rule. His conscience then becomes the supreme judge and monitor. So he feels like human beings individually and as a species, we've made further developments from that initial emergence of conscience that he has described. But look at it, the last thing he says here. Nevertheless, the first foundation or origin of the moral sense lies in the social instincts, including sympathy. And these instincts, no doubt, were primarily gained, as in the case of the lower animals, through natural selection. So what we have to remember is that maybe we've come a long way, but we have a nature capable of morality at all because of this combination of the social instincts and high intelligence that he suggested earlier. Well, is it a sufficient theory of the origin of human morality? I don't know. There are other evolutionary theories that emerged in the 20th century in evolutionary psychology to account for the emergence of morality. They're different from Darwin's, but we're not going to go into them. So, is Darwin's theory of the origin of the human moral sense sufficient? I don't know, but it's certainly incredibly interesting.